afternoon, everyone. I'm Talia Dekel, and welcome to today's briefing hosted by the Jerusalem Press Club. As the dust begins to settle over last week's election results, Israelis are now watching as coalition talks begin, with chatter focusing on which portfolios will be offered to whom and for what. While it is clear that Benjamin Netanyahu will return to office, questions remain over his next steps, as his new partners are likely to place him in precarious positions regarding a number of policy issues. With us this afternoon to consider the near future and help us understand the Israeli political horizon following the country's 5th election in under 4 years is Professor Reuven Hazan of Hebrew University's Political Science Department, also its former chair. Professor Hazan has advised the Speaker of the Knesset in the past, has consulted for several political parties, was a member of the Presidential Commission on the Structure of Government, and led the Knesset Committee's Reform Project. Professor Hazan, I know you've prepared a brief presentation, but perhaps before you can begin, you can give us your thoughts on the stability of the likely government ahead of us. Can Israelis look forward to a period of political calm?
Well, good afternoon, Talia. I am speaking to you from the virtual background of the Knesset. I'm not actually there. You ask about stability. Well, every question like that needs to be put into perspective, and compared to what we've had for the last 3.5 years, we're going to have extreme stability. I don't know if it will last the full 4 years, and there's a quirk in the Israeli law that has to be discussed if it can actually last for a little more than 4 years. But the era of governments collapsing within 6 to 12 months of being put in office, or governments not being formed after an election, that is clearly behind us. And one of the things I'd like to explain in a couple of minutes when we start is why this has happened. In other words, it's a lot easier to analyze how we got to where we are today, and not so much of where we're going from now, because everything is open. So shall I begin?
Yes, please go ahead, sir.
Okay. So in order to understand what we're doing now and where we are going, we really have to look back, because as Talia said, this was the 5th election in 3.5 years. As a parliamentary democracy, it is not so strange that you have an election and a government cannot be formed, or cannot be formed that holds on for a while. Early elections are prevalent in many democracies. Back-to-back elections also happen. They've happened in Canada, in Ireland, in Britain, in Spain. But having 5 elections in 3.5 years is something that no other democracy has done before us. Now, I can't go over all of the previous 4 elections, so I'm just going to take the last one. In other words, the one we had 1.5 years ago, because it is symptomatic of everything that happened in the first 4 elections. And then we'll turn everything on its head as we explain these elections. So let me share with you, I have a PowerPoint that is open somewhere here. Let me make sure that I have the correct one open. If you will bear with me for 1 second, because we have so many numbers that without looking at that, we can't really get our head around things. Okay, so here we go. I'm sharing this screen with you. I hope everybody can see it.
Yes, we can see it.
If you can see it, these are the 2021 results. And as you can see, we have a whole host of parties. And if we started to focus on each one of them and the number of seats, we'd be here for much longer than the 30-minute presentation. So I'm trying to make everybody think like an Israeli. And in Israel, we think not about parties, but about party blocks. Most Israelis belong to a certain ideological family of parties. They will swing between one party or another in the block, but they will rarely go outside that block. So I've color-coded the blocks. And as you can see, as you jump up and down this table, the colors are blue for the right or the hawkish block, red for the left or the dovish block, black for the ultra-Orthodox block, green for the Israeli Arab block, and purple for the center. To make a little bit more sense, let me present the blocks. Here are the blocks from last year. And as you can see, The hawkish bloc with 56 seats was by far the largest bloc. Likud with 30 seats was by far the largest party. We have 120 seats in the Israeli parliament, so a mathematical majority is 61, and that's what you needed to govern. The religious parties I put to the right, in other words, under the Hawks, because the religious parties would prefer to govern with the Hawks for their own biblical reasons of wanting to hold on to the territories. I put the Arab parties under the Doves because if that would have been a possibility, the Arabs would support the dovish positions on a land for peace agreement. And the center is somewhere in the middle. It's not between two blocks. It's not half hawkish or half dovish, for example. It's different. It's almost on another dimension. Now, if you look at the Hawks plus the religious parties a year ago, they had 72 seats. That's a clear majority. We should have had a government. By the way, these are exactly the same results we had in the two elections in 2019 and the first elections in 2020. In other words, the Hawks and the religious have won majorities in all 5 Knesset elections. The only reason we went to 5 elections is that beyond security and beyond religion, we had another issue that split Israeli politics, and that is that these last couple of elections have been a referendum on Netanyahu. Are you willing to sit in a government that is headed by him? If the answer is yes, then you think that the court cases are fake, that he will be found innocent, or are you not willing to sit in a government headed by him, in which case you think he's a criminal, the Attorney General has justifiably indicted him on multiple counts, and that he does not deserve to be prime minister. If you go back to the blocks, what you will see is that nothing has changed in 4 out of the 5 blocks, but in the hawkish bloc, they are split down the middle between the 2 parties that were willing to sit under Netanyahu and the 3 parties that were not. For those of you who weren't here a year and a half ago, Yamina is Naftali Bennett's party, Israel Our Home is Avigdor Lieberman's party, and New Hope was Gidon Saar's party. These parties, with a total of 20 seats, refused to sit under Netanyahu, and therefore they took the majority that the Hawks plus the religious had, and they made it into a minority of 52. That is the only reason that the Hawks and the religious were not in power and governing. And the end result of pulling these 3 parties out of the hawkish camp was to create a coalition government that had never been seen in Israel before. Parties from the Hawks, parties from the Doves, parties from the center, parties from the Arabs. In other words, mathematically, they had 62, but ideologically, it did not make any sense. There was nothing to keep this government together other than their antagonism to Benjamin Netanyahu, which means that anyone who looked at Israeli politics a year and a half ago when this government was formed knew we had to take out the stopwatch because there was no way that this government was going to last. And the fact that it lasted a bit over a year is actually quite good compared to the prospects we had given it. So what happened? On June 2nd, Lapid and Bennett informed that they had formed a majority of 62. By a few days later, when they swore their government in, 1 member of Lapid's party already left. In other words, the 62 went down to a razor-thin majority of 61. In other words, before they were sworn in, we knew this was not going to last. On the day the government was sworn in, 1 of them didn't show up to vote. So it was a 60 to 59 vote in favor of the new government. This was the narrowest vote in Israel's history. A few months after that, another member of Bennett's party said she cannot stick around any longer. He lost the majority, and by the end of June, the Knesset decided to dissolve. If you don't have a majority, you cannot legislate, you cannot function, you cannot govern, and we had early elections set for November 1st. These are the results. You've all seen them in the last couple of days. Again, stop thinking in terms of parties and think in terms of blocks. And what are we doing now? What does the law say? It says that the president will wait for the official results, which should come out by Tuesday or Wednesday next week. He will then invite delegations of each party that won seats and ask them who can form a majority government. They will tell him who they prefer. He will then give that person 28 days, which can be extended for 14 more. The law says he can appoint a second person if the first one doesn't succeed, but we don't have to go there because this time around, the first person is going to succeed. Let's look at the blocks. The hawkish parties, the two of them now, have 46 seats, and the religious parties have 18. You add that up and you've got 64, and there you have the next government in Israel. In other words, even with the split in the hawkish camp over Netanyahu, which puts Avigdor Lieberman's party out because they will not sit under Netanyahu, the hawks and the religious have 64. If Netanyahu was not an issue, the hawks and the religious would have 70, which is exactly what they've had in the last 4 elections. In other words, to put it in the bluntest way, we are now towards the end of 2022. We should have been in the 3rd year of a hawkish religious government back from early 2019. The only reason we went to election after election was the split in the hawkish camp over Netanyahu. And with the last elections, that split has been done away with because those parties who are willing to sit under Netanyahu now have a majority of 64, and they will form the next government. Now, if anyone wants to look at what it looks like, opposition versus coalition, this is what it looks like, and it makes ideological sense. A lot more than the government of a year and a half ago, which leads me back to Talia's first question. It looks like it will survive a lot longer than the previous government. So we're forming a new government. We had an election. By a week after the elections, the official results will be announced. The president will consult with the parties, and he will assign a task of forming a government to the person who gets the most support, which will clearly be Netanyahu. On November 15th, the new Israeli parliament, the 25th parliament, will be sworn into office. And if you count 42 days from when the president will appoint someone, by late December, we must have a government in Israel. Based on everything that I can see, we will have a government in Israel, and we might have it a lot earlier than late December. So to end, what are the main lessons? The hawkish bloc is clearly the biggest in Israel, but it continues to be split between those who are willing to govern under Netanyahu and those who are not. The religious and the hawks have really won every one of these 5 elections. What you see are the number of seats that these 2 blocs have had in 5 elections, and they've had a clear majority. The Likud is the biggest party. It hasn't performed the best in the last elections. It's actually their 2nd worst result, but overall their bloc did better. The dovish bloc has been obliterated. Why? A whole host of reasons, but basically they've been taken over by the center bloc. So if you put the center and the doves together, you realize that nothing much has changed on that side of the Israeli political map. Netanyahu will easily be able to form a government, but he will be a hostage to extremist elements, both to his right and in the religious bloc. And any one of these 3 parties, it doesn't require more than one. If they pull out of the government, they will bring it down. But as I said, I don't see that happening anytime soon, which means no more elections again. Will this coalition last? We don't know. But anyone who already had May of next year on their calendar as the 6th election in Israel in about 4 years, that is not going to happen. So thank you very much. And one of these days, come up and visit the campus of the Hebrew University. That's it.
So the first thing that we'll do is take that date off of our calendars because we've already put it in as a reoccurring date. And thank you very much for your very, very, very clear presentation. One of the things you mentioned was that we don't see this government ending anytime soon, but is there something that could stop it from being formed in the first place? If we're talking about the allocation of portfolios, to candidates who are to Netanyahu's right. Is there anything that is so extreme that could be requested that will inherently risk the potential government?
Well, you ask an interesting question. Rationally, the answer should be no. There will be a government. They've said before that they're going to run together, and they've stuck together very nicely in the opposition for the last year and a half. They ran promising to sit together in the previous elections. In other words, this pro-Netanyahu bloc has held out for the last 3.5 years. I don't see them breaking apart now when they finally achieved their goal. But I began by saying rationally, because when you talk about extremists, there's one thing you can count on for extremists, that they won't always be rational. And they could ask for too much. And Netanyahu has to understand that giving them certain portfolios will either incur the wrath of the Israeli voter or incur the wrath of our international allies, such as the United States, or incur the wrath of economic partners around the world, such as in the European Union. In other words, he has to tread softly. But, and let's go back to the main issue. We have had 5 elections because of the split on Netanyahu. And what this means is that now that he's won, he will do anything and everything to form a government and become prime minister. That is his one and only goal, and it has what has driven him to force the country into multiple elections. In other words, when push comes to shove, and you put the interests of the more extremist elements in Israeli politics opposed to those of our friends and allies and the more moderate voting public in Israel, if Netanyahu is forced into that situation, he will cave into the more extremist elements and form a government. That is exactly what he has wanted for 3.5 years. I don't see him saying no now.
Okay. In previous elections, we saw really large governments formed, and there was always a lot of criticism about, obviously, what that means for the taxpayer in terms of the number of ministers and, of course, deputy ministers who are often asked what they actually do in their offices. Given the small number of parties in the coalition, we're talking now about 4 parties, do you think that that will change? Will we go back to smaller governments?
That would be nice to see, but you have to look at it not just from the economic perspective of how much it costs us to have so many cabinet members. You have to look at it from the political perspective. According to the law in Israel, every member of the Israeli cabinet can sit in government meetings and debate issues as much as they want, support them, oppose them, vote for or against. But once there is a government decision and it is brought to the floor of the Israeli parliament, every member of the government must vote with the government. In other words, the larger a government is, the more votes it already has on the floor of the parliament. So if the government ends up being 25, 30 cabinet members, that means Netanyahu already has half the votes he needs in order to push any legislation through, should any of the partner parties not be able to keep all their members in line. So yes, there's a cost to having large government, but there's a political benefit to it. So maybe we'll see a few lesser cabinet members than we've seen before, but I don't see this number being reduced dramatically, especially look at your previous question. He might be able to create multiple ministries in order to give all sorts of extremist people cabinet positions in order not to give them the positions they want that will in turn anger too many people inside and outside Israel. So Netanyahu is a consummate politician. Let's see how he survives this one. And if he gives the extremists what they want, then you can basically understand that his #1 goal is political survival.
Okay, so assuming we've got all the technical stuff out of the way, we know who's ministers of what. Let's move on a little bit to the policies themselves that we might see ahead of us, or policies that we won't see ahead of us. One journalist is asking if we should expect a complete unraveling of the progressive policies pushed or passed in the outgoing coalition.
Well, it depends what you mean by progressive policies that were pushed by the outgoing coalition. I haven't really seen them do too much strategic and dramatic legislation. Keep in mind that within that coalition, you had a very right-wing party. We all try to think of Naftali Bennett as a nice middle-of-the-road guy, but he led a party that essentially was the other half of the religious Zionists with Bezalel Smotrich. So it was a religious settler party. You also had Gidon Sa'ar. Gidon Sa'ar might seem to be more of a moderate member of the Likud, but Gidon Sa'ar wanted to dismantle some of the judicial branch in Israel, which he thought had become too independent. On the other extreme end, you had Mansour Abbas, which is basically an Islamic party. In other words, decisions on how he would vote were made by the Islamic High Council. This is no different than the ultra-Orthodox Shas party when they have to listen to the Council of Torah guardians in order to tell the members of Knesset how to vote. In other words, I don't see what the previous government did that was so dramatic because of its ideological makeup that all of it will be completely flipped this time around. Yes, there will be changes. This is a different government. But a 180-degree turn, first you have to tell me where we went in the last year and a half. Then I have to figure out what is 180 degrees from there.
Okay, so maybe we can go back even a little bit further to when Netanyahu was in power and talk about the potential policy changes that he had been pressed to make and didn't do so, even as the leader of the right wing. If we're talking about evacuation of outposts like Khan al-Ahmar, or even annexation, which was the biggie. The override clause, we have a number of different kinds of legislation that we can talk about that could have been pushed by right-wing government and weren't. Do you think that now we're in a position where it's so-called Israel's most right-wing government in its history, these policy changes will be made?
Well, I definitely expect some of them to be made. The override clause is something that is high up on the agenda. For me, it's a bothersome element because you're capable of undermining the Supreme Court. But the Supreme Court in Israel has been very liberal and very active, although less so in past years. So they have legitimately earned the ire of the right wing and the religious politicians. Now, it all depends on what the override clause looks like. We can't just look at it as a basket. If 61 members of Knesset can overrule a decision by the Supreme Court, then you have a clear undermining of the Supreme Court. But if you need a supermajority, if it's larger than what the current government has, if it's 70 or 80, then what you're saying is that a consensus in the political system should be able to push its legislation through. There are countries in the world, such as Great Britain, where the Supreme Court cannot oversee legislation by the legislative branch. There are countries in the world, like Canada, that have an override clause. So while this clause, I don't look at it as anything positive, I'm not scared yet until I see the parameters. When you look at annexation, honestly, with a Biden administration, can we talk about annexation? In other words, the relationship is going to be strained enough with the Democratic Party. We have to wait and see what happens in the United States in a couple of days if the Republicans take control of one or both houses. But still, with a president and a Secretary of State that doesn't support annexation, if this wasn't done when Trump was there, I don't see it being done at least in the next 2 years. There are issues that I think we are going to push through that are going to anger people. I do see building more settlements. I do see building housing in Jerusalem. These are issues that Netanyahu is not going to be able to stop, and that the world will complain. But honestly, have we had a peace process lately? Have we had a viable peace partner lately? Do we have an American administration that is very involved in the Middle East, that we are very high on the agenda? None of these are around, so it'll be easier for Netanyahu to get away with it now than when we had the Obama administration and he really ran into a wall.
Okay, let's move on a little bit to public discourse. I know we are running out of time, but there's still a few more interesting questions. When we talk about issues such as the Supreme Court, and if you look at polls put out by institutions prior to the election, public support of institutions and even just the belief in our government and all of our institutions is dropping. Do you think that the support, the public support for our institutions, specifically the Supreme Court, which took a big hit over the last few years because of these voices speaking about too much power, can be resuscitated, or are we going to continue in that direction where the courts have too much power, largely as a result of the campaign against it?
Well, this is a malaise that is not, it doesn't belong to Israel. It belongs to most of the Western democratic world, that elected institutions are going down in public support and unelected institutions are going up. So what you see in Israel are elements like the Israeli army, the presidency, and others that are more favorable in the eyes of Israelis than the political parties and the Israeli parliament or the government. This is a trend. It doesn't just sit here, it sits anywhere in the democratic world. The Supreme Court is not an elected institution. It used to have massive public support. It got hit, as you said correctly, when the politicians took it on. It has regained some of its support, but it has done so because judges have been appointed that are more conservative, and the agenda of the Supreme Court has been much less activistic over the last couple of years. In other words, I would say that the hawks have actually gotten a lot of what they want from the Supreme Court already. And to further undermine it, I don't see why they would want to spend political capital on that. But on the other hand, the religious Zionists and Shas, for example, this is very high on their list. So Netanyahu would probably be more than happy to give in on that and save his efforts for other issues when he'll have to take them on. Basically, your previous question, when things on the ground will encounter international objection, and he'll only be able to push so far.
You mentioned Shas, and in general, we haven't really spoken a lot about the ultra-Orthodox. Do you believe that in the coalition talks, and I know that I'm going back in the conversation, but do you believe that in the coalition talks we could see promises being made to scale back actual legislation that was considered harmful to the Haredi community, if we're talking about funding of institutions, even things like disposable utensils law, things like that?
Well, these are small elements that can easily be given in by Netanyahu, and he curries favor with those parties and with their voter base. So yes, that will clearly happen. Funding issues will clearly happen. It is maybe ironic that the two ultra-religious parties, and of the two, Shas more, both because the United Torah party has a new leader who we don't know yet, but those of us who have followed him, he seems a little more, how shall I put it? I'm trying to use a word that if anybody quotes me, I'm not going to get into too much trouble. He seems to be more of a firebrand than what we've seen before. Aryeh Deri is considered the grown-up in the group. In other words, Netanyahu can deal with Shas and with Aryeh Deri a lot more than he can deal with these young extremist politicians like Smotrich and Ben Gvir that he's going to have to face around the cabinet table, and they're going to make his life difficult. Aryeh Deri will probably be the guy he can lean on. So I think it's ironic that we've come to the point where the leader of an ultra-Orthodox party, a sectarian party interested in their own voter base, even at the expense of everybody else, is the strong element that Netanyahu can lean on for moderation within the next government. that tells you a lot about what the next government and its internal dynamics might look like.
Right, right. Just two last questions, if I may, even though we're going a little bit over time. One more question on the formation of the government itself. Several names were mentioned as candidates for senior offices who weren't elected. Yossi Cohen to Defense, Ron Dermer to Foreign Affairs. What is your opinion on professional ministers versus leadership that was actually elected by the people?
Well, it depends on the job. I don't think that we need professionals in government unless they can do better than elected officials. Professionals are also not accountable to anyone, not to a party, not to a voter base. They're only accountable to the person who appointed them, and that is Netanyahu. In other words, any professional that is put into office, you can't look at that as someone who really knows how to handle that office. And you should look at it as someone that is put there in order for Netanyahu to be able to get what he wants out of that office. So I'm not so much in favor of professionals. And I think that with the Likud party that has stood by Netanyahu election after election, including a year and a half in the opposition, if he doesn't give the top people there enough cabinet positions, he might have a little bit of a rebellion in the party. And remember, he only has 3 other parties, and each one of those is a somewhat sizable party by Israeli terms. You don't have tiny parties of 4 or 5 seats. He's going to have to give them multiple cabinet positions to each one of them, and each one can bring him down. So yes, he'd like to have people in positions where he can pick up the phone and tell them what to do. And if they don't, then he can fire them and they're gone. But I don't think we're going to see too many of those. We might see 1 or 2, but not both in foreign affairs and defense. If we end up with that, then Netanyahu is really, I think it was Time magazine that called him King Bibi. I don't think we're there yet.
Okay, and just one last question on bringing things back to the public. We've heard many apocalyptic scenarios in social media in Israel and even in the Jewish news across the world, actually, following the results of this elections. Feelings that are being reflected as existing rifts in Israeli society. What do you think the government can do, or should it be coming from the government to reconnect both halves of the nation, or is this just a fantasy?
Well, the previous government didn't do too good of a job with the largest minority in Israel, which is the Israeli Arabs. They might have brought an Israeli Arab party into the government for the first time ever, and maybe they just didn't have enough time to deal with things. But when it comes to at least 2 elements that really helped the extreme right wing gain a significant number of seats, which is A, violence within the Israeli Arab community, and B, the clashes we saw in mixed cities between Arabs and Jews. These 2 issues, the previous government didn't do too much about, and I don't see this government doing anything about. If anything, they will probably exacerbate those tensions, and that is a dangerous thing. When it comes to the second most important division in Israeli society and the second largest social minority in Israel, those are the ultra-Orthodox. And the last government, although it didn't take them on as much as it could have, but it didn't do them any good. So here you might see a little bit more of mending fences, but at the same time, moderate, secular, left-wing, liberal Israeli society will be angered by what the ultra-Orthodox will get. In other words, Netanyahu is being pulled in every possible direction. And we're going to have to see how much he gives in and to whom. But remember, his number 1 goal is survival and getting out of the legal predicament that he's in. And any one of these parties that wants even extreme issues from him, if they will back him on this, they might get it. In other words, this is a weaker Netanyahu than we've seen in previous governments, and a Netanyahu who is much more focused on himself than in previous governments. We've actually seen this as a trend with every Netanyahu government. This is going to be the 6th. And What can I tell you? I'm not as worried as most people who are saying that the country's over, because it isn't, but there's definitely cause to be worried.
I did promise that's the last question, but you created a follow-up question, so it's not my fault. You mentioned the secular population kind of being sidelined with these trends. How long do you think it'll take before we see another another round of protests at Balfour, thousands of people with signs trying to bring Bibi down again, or are we, are they just going to accept the situation and move their energies to doing things politically, building up the base, strengthening Meretz again, strengthening labor? Is that the way they're going to go?
Well, I'm going to give you a very blunt answer. There are elements in Israeli society that are mobilized politically, that they work very hard between elections, and they work even harder during elections, and they are capable of turning out their voter base. If you see voting turnout in the geographical areas that are usually identified with the religious Zionists or the ultra-Orthodox parties, you'll see very, very high voter turnout. All the people, the secular, the left wing, the liberals, the ones who are basically half of Israel, they did not work hard enough between elections. The government that they managed to put into power for the last year could not get its act together and convince people that they were running the country in a better way. And they definitely didn't work hard enough during the elections, because if they had turned out in the same percentages as the other camp, we would have a completely different government in Israel. And for example, the Israeli Arabs are a larger minority than the ultra-Orthodox. If they turned out in massive numbers like the ultra-Orthodox did, not only would they change the political map in Israel, but they would be able to decide who would be the next prime minister and the next government. So the fact that they sit it out is regrettably part of the answer to what we elected, and also part of an answer to your question. They can protest all they want. If they can't turn this into political mobilization when it comes to elections, these protests are a lot of hot air.
I think that's a great place to end. Professor Reuven Hazan, thank you again for your time and for your insight. And I'd like to thank my colleagues Eli Klotzstein and Matthias Sakal for facilitating this briefing. Have a good week, everybody. We hope you enjoyed that briefing by the Jerusalem Press Club. If you did, like the video and hit the subscribe button to stay up to date with all of our future content.